You did say like privatizing the university, which I think is thrown around a lot. At what point do we become private?
Well, you know, at this time, I think I get out and march with the students. We have to be careful about that term. You know, I mean, Stanford does a lot of good work in the world, and it's private and has community outreach and so forth. But what I would say is this: when the students are paying more money than the taxpayers, which is what it's going to be if this goes through, and when your appropriations level are the appropriations level of more than a decade ago, that is an enormous step toward privatization of the university. I mean, in the sense that the charges are moving toward a more market rate, if I can put it that way. They're not nearly what prestigious privates are. On the other hand, there's some unique characteristics of the University of California that Stanford doesn't have and that MIT doesn't have, and Columbia and Chicago and all the rest. We're 39% Pell eligible students. 39%. That's triple any Ivy League institution around the country. So we really do make it a point of pride to be a source of access, socioeconomic mobility. 39%. Over half of our entering students come from a family where the first language in the home is not English. It may be Spanish, it may be Vietnamese, it may be Chinese, it can be lots of things. So one characteristic of the University of California is that we have made a concerted effort to go after the low-income students who have fewer choices than more affluent students. And the other thing is we're a world-class research university. So Cal State has more low-income students, they have 47%, but they don't have a world-class research university. And then we can all think of world-class research universities that admit relatively few low-income students. The University of California is unique, so I consider that's not privatization. We have to maintain that. But if you mean the students are paying more and more of the cost of the education, that seems to be the road we're on. I mean,
on the issue of labels, UC Berkeley chancellor said in an interview a couple weeks ago that Berkeley is becoming a federal university. She was observing that the source of the funding of the campus has flipped dramatically in the past 6 years. I was wondering what you thought of that label, federal.
Well, I think what the chancellor was referring to is that we're really reaching the point where the state is getting farther and farther down the list of the providers of financial support to the university. I don't know if it's federal or not, but you could use that label, but the point is that, I mean, here are the numbers. The state, after this, if assuming the $500 million reduction, provides $2.5 billion, and there's $4.4 billion in research money. Almost twice as much is coming from the federal government. If you look at the medical schools, I mean, the ratio is even worse. I mean, you look at some place like UC San Francisco or the Reagan Hospital at UCLA, you know, it's less than 10 cents on the dollar is coming from the state. The rest is coming from patient revenues and research grants. So I think he's calling attention to the fact that, and now the students have jumped, unfortunately, the state of California and what they're paying. So, I mean, it's the state of California is like 4th on the list or something like that when you look at other people who are supporting the university. The problem is the other people are not always supporting the core academic programs. They're supporting, you know, they had an appendectomy, or they're doing research on producing a, you know, a better crop at Davis or whatever. So the money doesn't all flow the same way, but he's right in the sense that the state of California is going further and further down the list in terms of ranking the financial support we get from various sources.
And a couple of years ago, you wrote about this topic about getting more federal funding for higher education. I guess where do you now, a few years later, where do you see that?
Well, what I wrote, for those of you not familiar, was a little white paper which I never published, but it got circulated around. I said the federal government is sort of cherry picking and just supporting things that it believes in, but the core structure of the university is in jeopardy. So I suggested 2 things, actually. One was that when you enroll more Pell students, so there's an incentive to enroll more low-income students, that there be an add-on. So you have $1 million in Pell Grants, I'm just making up numbers, but you have a 10% add-on. and you would be required by the feds to use the 10% in your instructional program. No fooling around with that. It goes right into the instructional program. So I thought it would have a beneficial effect because, you know, a Pell Grant is a check or a voucher, if you like. And you still have to have the capacity to absorb these students. And you know, effectively, community colleges have 300,000 students who are not serving. It doesn't matter whether they have a Pell Grant. There's no room for them. They can't get their courses. So I thought having an add-on would strengthen the university and provide an incentive, even for the privates, to enroll more low-income students, which I'm deeply in favor of. And then the other was then an add-on in research, because most of the research, as you all know, is done by at the direction of faculty, but it's really done by graduate students, and they need to have their courses, they need to have their thesis supervised, they need graduate stipends, I mean, they need a lot of things. So I proposed a similar add-on. You get $1 million in research grants, you get $100,000, has to go into the instructional program of the university. It's interesting. I went around Washington and people conceptually agreed with me. I mean, I won't tell you where I went, but I got as close to the White House as they would let me without shooting me. And I went to the Department of Education, I went to the chairs of key committees in the Senate and in the House. But there were other priorities, and there was health care, and there was financial reform and other things, and they said, we'll get to it. And that was in good faith. I'm not being criticized. And then, you know, the economy really bottomed out, the elections occurred, so I don't think the prospects are good. Long-winded answer, for the next couple of years. I also think we need to rethink the Pell Grants and how we administer them, and think about how we can get more bang for the buck, how we can help more students attend universities. Because at some point, just raising the Pell Grants doesn't create space for the universities. I mean, whatever the higher Pell Grants have accomplished is really deeply undercut if our admissions are relatively flat, if Cal State is relatively flat or maybe goes up or down a little bit, and community colleges are suffering. At the end of the day, there aren't enough places for those Pell recipients to go to school. And that's because it only covers nationally 30% of their actual expenses. When Pell was enacted, it covered 70%.
We are working, Emma, both on a campus basis and system-wide to address the issue of underfunding and indirect cost recovery, because that is something where we're disadvantaged both by being a public and also by being in the Western region. And we have dramatic examples of a woman from San Diego's on. You know, we're just treated very differently than other regional offices, and we're treated very differently as a public than as a private. Most of our schools are between, campuses are between 52 and 54% in indirect cost. Places like Harvard and MIT are 68%. You know, when the president mentions $4.5 billion, that's hundreds of millions of dollars in lost indirect cost recovery that we don't get.
Yeah, so we're working on that, and that's important because if you're losing money on many of your research grants, where does the money come from?
I'll be meeting with a number of foundations in New York and one in Washington in early April about this point. The foundations want high-quality research for whatever topic they're interested in, but if they just pay the researchers, don't pay the research infrastructure, the quality of the research they get for what they want done diminishes. And it's something they have to understand.